And if the clerk would take a silent roll, that would be appreciated. We do not have any minutes of our last meeting because our last meeting was a public hearing, at which time we approved all the prior minutes. But would like to start out and welcome two new members, Delegate Anderson and Delegate Bates, to the committee, and we welcome your input and interaction. Today's agenda, we have a couple of items. We'll have a summary report of our meetings from last year. Then we'll get into a report from Dr. Deskins on personal income tax. And then we'll have a report from Dr. Deskins and Deputy Secretary Mukau on our variable component of the gasoline tax. And then we'll open things up for questions. But without further ado, Mr. Billings.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Tax Reform Committee, I am Jeff Billings, and I've been serving as your committee clerk since our first meeting. Today, I would like to briefly recap this committee's work so far and what we have heard in our meetings last summer and fall. After this, I will be happy to take questions if there are any. I believe in your packet should be an actual word for word, or not word for word, but a recap of what we talked about over the summer and fall. As you know, the House Speaker and the Senate President believe improving our state's business climate is a top priority, and fundamental tax reform is a critical step in accomplishing this goal. This committee was formed with a laser focus to review our state's tax code and recommend any changes that would help West Virginia reach her potential. We held 8 informational meetings last year and examined a wide variety of potential tax reform topics, including property tax, sales tax, corporation and business taxes, alcohol, beer, and wine taxes, cigarette taxes, and personal income taxes. We discussed the differences between West Virginia's tax structure compared to the rest of the nation, and reviewed the previous 2 tax studies conducted during the Manchin and Underwood administrations. The tax reform staff attempted, and I believe succeeded, in inviting the top policy experts in West Virginia and from around the country to analyze and discuss our tax structure. These policy experts included Revenue Secretary Bob Kiss, Deputy Revenue Secretary Mark Muco, who will be speaking later this afternoon, Mark Morton, General Counsel for the State Tax Division, WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research Director John Deskins, who will also be speaking later, Marshall Center for Business and Economic Research Jennifer Shand, Jared Walzak from the Tax Foundation, author and economist Dr. Russ Sobel, and many, many others. These top-tier policy experts produced several reports and offered informative testimony to help further this committee's goals. We also heard from elected officials from municipalities and counties around the state to offer their perspective on the state's tax system. They include former Wheeling Mayor Andy McKenzie, Huntington Mayor Steve Williams, Cabell County Commissioner Nancy Cartmill, and Summers County Commissioner Jack Woodrum. Finally, we held 4 public hearings on tax reform in Martinsburg, Bluefield, Wheeling, and Charleston. Committee members attended these regional meetings to hear ideas and concerns from local citizens. We spread these meetings out in different parts of the state to get different perspectives on how our state code is perceived by people in geographically diverse areas such as our panhandles and border areas. As a reminder, every presentation from every meeting last year, including information from the public hearings, is available on our website. All the information we receive this year will also be added to the website. We encourage you to share that information as much as possible. Before opening up the questions, I would like to take a moment to thank the other staff members. We have Nancy Butcher, and most of them are located on your other side over here to my left. Nancy Butcher, Grant White, Matt Pauley, James Fierhoff, Michael Cook, Justin Hawthorne, Dan Greer, Richie Heath, Fred Lewis, Melissa Lilly, Mark McGowan, and Stephen Allen Adams, who is right over here filming us and doing the social media stuff. We thank you guys, and they all do good work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there are any questions.
Are there any questions of Jeff? Members were emailed this earlier, so hopefully they had a chance to review that. Obviously, we are not at the stage of a final report. That's why we have what we have in front of us, and ultimately, as we have additional meetings, the end product will result in a final report. On the agenda, and I'll also mention in your packet, there was a final copy of the tobacco tax report that Dr. Deskins put together, and that was distributed during session. But again, just for your all's information. And next on the agenda would be the report that's in your packet on the personal income tax policy. Dr. Deskins. And the committee also was supplied a copy of this in advance, so I'm sure that they're all well read and up to date. May have to. Why don't you just take this one? This one's mine.
All right. I'll just. Is Jeff coming back? I'll just take his chair. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I sure am glad to be back down. As you probably know already, I'm really excited about any opportunity that I can get to come down and do what I can to help you think about public policy and to provide data and information on what the research says about public policy. Just we'll say really quickly, you all know that I speak around the state about every week on our economic situation, and I often have so much bad news to report. And so many of our challenges are long-term challenges. Things like poor health outcomes and the drug abuse epidemic are obviously very long-term challenges. We're not going to turn the drug abuse epidemic around in one night or one day. But the one positive is if we do find some problem with public policy, if we find some tweak that we can make to the personal income tax or whatever element of public policy, that is something that we can do in short order. So I'm happy to work in this area in part for that reason. It's not so daunting, not so long run. Mostly what I have here in the personal income tax report is a presentation on what we can do. I mean, this is not by any means a full analysis. This is not all that I am able to say or want to say about the personal income tax, but this is just an overview into the issue and a presentation of what we can do if you see fit to move forward with reform of the PIT in some way, and if you'd like for my office to do even more research. But I'll get to that in just a second. First off, I just thought I would remind you all of kind of where our personal income tax rates compare to the nation, to other states, and to surrounding states. You've probably seen this before, so I'll go through it quickly, but it makes sense to look at this as a reminder. Just first and foremost, how much do we rely on the PIT? PIT revenue as a share of total tax revenue. How much importance do we place on the PIT? Here you see all 41 PIT taxing states, and I'm reporting PIT revenues as a share of total revenues. And so you see West Virginia is actually the yellow, is West Virginia obviously. We are right next to the national average in terms of reliance on the PIT. So check, that's kind of a good thing that we're not an outlier in some way. We're right next to the national average. Just really quickly, here's a reminder of the structure of our PIT before we get into the other rate comparisons. I just want to remind you of the structure. There you see for virtually all households married filing jointly, for example, we have a graduated rate structure with marginal rates going from 3% up to 6.5%. There we top out at 6.5% for households with income above $60,000. So that's 6.5% top rate. Here's where that top rate compares to other states. We're kind of close to the middle in terms of that 6.5% top rate. 17 states are higher than us, 23 states are lower than us. among the states that tax personal income. So kind of close to the middle, although I've highlighted our adjacent states in green, we are higher than all of the adjacent states there. And I will say that the top marginal rate, even though we have 5 different rates, 5 different brackets in our structure, the top rate generally gets more attention in the literature because it's believed that the top rate is what generates most of the behavioral distortion that goes along with the personal income tax, because those higher income taxpayers who face that top marginal rate are probably the ones that are most likely to respond to state tax policy, although that's not a definite. Because of that, it's also interesting to look at what marginal rate is faced by the median household. In this figure, I show you, I take the median taxpayer for all households married filing jointly with 2 dependents, and what marginal rate do they face. Now in West Virginia, that happens to be 6.5%. Our structure is relatively flat. That top rate comes in at a relatively low income level, so we have a relatively less progressive system in some ways. So that 6.5% is the rate that our typical household pays, married filing jointly 2 dependents, and you see where we stand. We are exceeded by 11 states in that measure, and again higher than all of our neighboring or adjacent states. Just real quick as a reminder, those 2 key measures, the top marginal rate and the marginal rate for median income. Again, there's just another graphic so you can see how we compare to the adjacent states. We're the highest on both dimensions among our adjacent states. But there's even more to the PIT with the various exemptions, deductions, and credits. There's so many different ways to characterize a PIT. In this figure, I show you an effective rate measure, right? We have top marginal rate for the median household income, and then just an overall kind of average rate. Here we just simply divide personal income tax revenues by personal income in the state to get this average effective rate measure. And here you see where we stand. We're 16th highest out of 41 personal income taxing states, and you see we're a few notches above the overall national average there. So again, take that for what you will, but it just makes sense to kind of see where we stand relative to all states, where we stand relative to neighboring states as we begin a discussion of the PIT. Really quickly, before we get into analyzing potential reform of our rates and our brackets, I just talk about these 2 preferences for low-income families. Of course, it's important to make sure that we take care of our lowest income households, of course, so we have these 2 different preferences to ensure that low-income households aren't being overly burdened by the personal income tax. Low-income earned income exclusion and the family tax credit. I'm not going to go into all the details here. Of course, if you look at the full report, you can see the discussion that we provide. I will say that these 2 are largely redundant, and we make some recommendations about streamlining the system that won't really affect any issue of substance, just make the system easier to comply with and understand. But just focus on the family tax credit. So how it works is, again, this depends on marital status, it depends on dependents, but I'm just picking a married couple with 2 kids, 2 dependents for illustrative purposes, but the point's going to remain whatever kind of household you look at. But for that household, the family tax credit ensures that that household doesn't pay any personal income tax at all up to an income of $23,550. Now that number does change from year to year based on inflation, but I'm using a number for the most recent year of data that we had. But that household's completely exempted from the PIT up to $23,550, but then we phase out this credit over the next $3,000 of income, okay, such that by the time you get to $26,250, it's around $3,000, by the time you get to $26,250, family tax credit has completely disappeared, and you're just paying your normal tax liability that would result based on the rate schedule that I presented first or second slide. Okay, so completely exempt up to $23,500, phased out over the next $3,000 of income. But what we have here is we have a little concern over a behavioral distortion because of the way in which this tax policy is phased out. right? As you go from 23.5 to 26.5, you know, you're earning more income, you're facing more taxes, but the credit that you received is dropping off dramatically. And so the effective personal income tax rate that you face as you lose that family tax credit, the effective marginal rate that you face becomes very high. Here what I show is an effective PIT rate calculation that's driven by, that's based on that family tax credit phase out. And as you see, the actual, the real effective rate that you face as that's phased out actually jumps up to 20 or 25% as your income is in that threshold range. Then of course, after you get to 26,500 and move on up to 50,000, 60,000, whatever, then obviously you fall back into our normal rate structure. But you can see how that phase out leads to a spike. So you might be concerned that the way in which we phase this program out, you might be concerned that some people would set their income just right on the bottom of that phase out region, right before they face those higher marginal tax rate. You might think you might see clustering around that 23.5. So what I've done here, this isn't a full analysis, this is just suggestive evidence. What I've done here is I've taken just household income and I've put it into $3,000 increments. So the yellow bar is the number of households that are paying taxes that have an income between roughly 23.5 and 26.5, that $3,000 increment over which the family tax credit is phased out. So the number of households in that income bracket, then the income bracket with $3,000 above that, $3,000 above that, and then 3 and 3 below. Does that make sense what I'm showing here? Just the number of households in each of those $3,000 buckets. Now, just in general, you're going to expect that those are going to be relatively flat. If we have a broad income distribution, if we have households with income 15, 20, 25, 30, you would expect those bars to be relatively even. But you do see what I believe to be some suggestive evidence that people are recognizing that high effective rate that comes into effect, that high rate that comes into effect when the family tax credit is phased out, and they are cutting their income, they are stopping right at the threshold amount. Thus you see about 250 households shifted from the yellow bar to the bar below it. So there is some evidence of a behavioral distortion going on here. And I just will say, in tax policy research, the kind of stuff that I do, the stuff that I wrote my dissertation on, this is the kind of thing that we're looking for all the time. We're just looking for what kind of distortions do we see associated with the personal income tax or any tax program. Now, I will say, I can't say whether this distortion is a lot or a little. It's really hard to say, and I think it's a judgment call, and I think that's kind of up to you to decide. But we're talking about 250 households that are seem to be shifted down to a slightly low income level right around this phase out region. So I don't know how much of a concern that is. Just in general though, a more generic analysis here, we have two different ways that we can exempt low income households from taxes. One way is you can just take the personal exemption approach. That way you can just say all income below a certain level. In this generic slide, I'm picking $20,000. That's just a round number that I just picked. But under a personal exemption approach, you would say that all income below that threshold goes tax-free, and then when you earn your $20,000 and first dollar of income, then you start paying taxes, and then your tax liability rises accordingly. Under the tax credit approach, everybody under $20,000 is completely exempt from taxes, but when you hit that threshold amount, you owe all the taxes on all of your income. That first $20,000 isn't exempted. $20,001, you pay taxes on $20,001, even though you're just $1 above the threshold amount. So the tax credit approach is where we potentially see this distortion that this is a little bit of an oversimplification because the phase-out region occurs over a $3,000 range, but it still communicates the idea. But under a tax credit approach, you face that behavioral distortion. You face a situation in which people work a little bit less because of that high marginal rate that they face. That's the problem with the tax credit approach. But with the exemption approach, the problem is you're foregoing a lot of tax revenue on all those dollars of income down in the low threshold amounts. You're foregoing a lot of tax revenue for people who are even making $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. So you're really leaving a lot on the table under the personal exemption approach. In West Virginia, we have a hybrid of these two approaches because we do have a $2,000 personal exemption in addition to the FTC, of course. So we have kind of a hybrid, but that figure just lays out the positives and negatives of each approach. And if you want to study fundamental tax reform, you just have to think about which approach do you want to go with and the positives and negatives on each side, because neither side is clearly advantageous. So that's some basic background information. Anything else that you need along these lines, give me a call. I mean, have Chairman Nelson, I'm putting you to work here. Have Chairman Nelson give me a call, and I will say, I mean, this is completely, I mean, my office has been around since the 1940s, and our mission has always been to provide you, our state's leaders, with this kind of data, research, and analysis that you need. But so here's what we mostly did in the study. We looked at several different ways in which we could reform our rates and brackets. I mean, we could reform the exemptions, the credits, those things that I've mentioned already. But the heart is reforming the rates and brackets. So I'm showing you just various tax reform scenarios that we could consider. So what I've done here, first off, on the left, you see the current tax system. You see, the rate structure there. You see the personal exemption. You see the revenue that we get out of the current tax system. But then I've shown you 3 different systems that would all be roughly revenue neutral. Now we've looked at actual tax return data over a 3-year period to determine that these particular rates and brackets would be roughly revenue neutral. So you see I've given you a flat rate alternative. If we switched to a flat rate of 5.1% for all income with a personal exemption of $2,000, that would be roughly revenue neutral. That would actually give us 1.1% in additional revenue, but we want to stick with round numbers, so it's hard to get it exactly. Does that make sense? Can't get it exactly revenue neutral if we're going to stick with round numbers. But a flat rate of 5.1%, then we have what I'm calling a moderately progressive alternative with 2 brackets, 0 to 30, and then above 30, with 2 rates of 3.8 and 6%. Then I have a more progressive system with 5 bracket structures that go from 4% to 7%. We have a higher personal exemption, and you can see the differences there. All those would be roughly revenue neutral. Whatever system you want to look at, let me know. If you want to tweak, the moderately progressive alternative, the more progressive alternative, we can analyze the data and tell you what rates and brackets would yield revenue neutrality, or this much more revenue, this much less net revenue, whatever. Another concern is over any potential alternative system that we adopt, a concern is how do average tax rates change? How does the burden of tax liability change across income groups? So what I've shown you here, a key way of looking at a system and how it affects the income distribution is looking at how the average tax rate changes over income. What's the average tax rate faced by a poor household? What's the average tax rate faced by a rich household? How does that average tax rate change? And so we can do that. Any scenario you give me that you would like to understand its implications, I can show you this figure. I can show you how the average tax rate will change. You see here I have a household of 30,000, or a household of 16,000, 22, 31, 42. You see the different household income levels at the bottom. You see how the average tax rate changes. If we see, for example, the flat tax, we see that the current system is obviously the blue. And the flat tax alternative, you see the average tax rate is higher compared to the current. And for lower income households, average tax rate is lower for higher income households under the flat tax alternative. You can see how it changes, for example, for the more progressive system and how the average tax rate rises on the right-hand side of that scale. You see that sharp spike on the red on the right-hand side. But whatever system you want to analyze, we can show you the variation in the average tax rate that would follow. Another way of looking at it is this. Tax incidence, who really bears the burden of our personal income tax in West Virginia. So here you see, under the current system, the top quintile, right? The top 20% of households pay 67% of all personal income tax in West Virginia. 22% for the fourth quintile. You see how that moves down the spectrum. But then you see, we can show you how this incidence will change across any proposed tax system. See, for example, under the flat tax, the share of the total tax burden that's borne by the top quintile shrinks from 67% down to 59%. But these are the kind of things that you would think about as you design a different tax system, and we can give you the real numbers that will reflect how any changes in structures and rates will play out. Another issue that we had a question over was indexing our brackets to inflation. Now, our brackets have been the same since '88, right? That 60,000 threshold for the 6.5% rate, that's been the same since '88. So, inflation we've had real income growth, but we just had inflation-driven income growth. Doesn't change buying power, but it increases your numbers. So that 60,000 is really effectively a lot lower than what it was in '88 when it was first introduced. But we looked at how this bracket creep, right? This is what economists refer to this as income pushes people into higher and higher tax brackets. That's called bracket creep. But we looked at how that has affected the system. Bracket creep's not good because it's really a distortion of the system that's not legislated, really. I mean, we want an explicit, transparent, understandable tax system, but if we don't index our brackets to inflation, then it leads to some distortions that's not necessarily intended. But at the same time, the fact of the matter is, what we have to be aware of is that bracket creep leads to more revenue. We looked at if we were to start indexing in 2013, if we had started indexing in 2013, what would revenues be in 2023 as bracket creep makes a difference over those years? And we estimated we'd get $80 million less in revenue by 2023 if we start indexing for inflation compared to a situation where we just leave our nominal brackets the same. It's going to be 3.5% less revenue 10 years down the road if we adopt indexing versus just leaving the brackets nominally the same. Okay? I'm not making a recommendation there. I'm just saying those are the kind of issues that we can look at as questions arise as you think about tax reform. Also, the report, I'm not going to bore you with all the details here, but the report also lays out several issues associated with retirees, Social Security income, military reduction for retirees, and we lay out how tax revenues will change. I didn't put the numbers in the report, but you have it in front of you, I think. But we lay out how revenues will change as we lead to more tax preferences for retirees or military retirees. I think that's all I have. But again, I don't have a lot of meat for you there, but my intention was to show you the analyses that we can do as questions arise as you consider personal income tax reform.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Deskins. Questions of the committee members?
I can.
Yes. Chairman Hall.
Oh.
How many states, we decouple, I guess that's the word you use, from the federal return deductions? Are we one of the few, or several states do that? Do they allow for you to use your federal deductions? And if we did that, what would be the cost?
Well, we haven't estimated that, but that's something that we can check on. I'm not for sure exactly how many states do that. Mark may be able to answer that even more better than me.
There are a number of states, Dale.
Well, let me get you to come up, please. I'm not sure if that's...
Seems
would
like
that
that.
cost us 20%, or what would be the revenue loss?
I don't know on the revenue loss. We have to do some work on that. West Virginians itemize less frequently than counterparts in just about every other state, so we have less incidence of itemization at the federal level. But itemized deductions were eliminated back in '87 as part of a plan to reduce tax rates. Tax rates used to be 13.5%, 14%, a lot higher than they are now. And one of the reasons is a number of our neighboring states follow the same pattern. Pennsylvania does not have itemized deductions, and they have a lower tax rate. Ohio does not have itemized deductions, lower tax rate. Indiana, no itemized deductions, lower tax rate. Illinois, same thing. I believe Massachusetts, same type of structure. So New Jersey, in this geographic area of the country, Mid-Atlantic, a number of states do not have itemized deductions. They tend to have lower tax rates. So that was the objective back then.
Is that regional? I mean, do people come here from other states and so they file a return and they lose their ability to itemize?
Haven't noticed any real reaction in recent years on that. Certainly when the changeover occurred back in 1987, there was some reaction.
Okay, so that was the trade-off.
The trade-off was lower tax rates. The tax base is broader and there are lower tax rates. Only about 20% of West Virginia filers itemized for federal income tax purposes.
And then I was going to ask the professor, in your change from the current rule where we have the spike at $23,000, in your change, did you deal with that? I mean, did you take that away?
No, we left the FTC as is, but that's a potential change that you can ask us and we'd be glad to do it. I'm just kind of showing what we can do here, but those numbers assume the family tax credit as it currently applies.
Okay, so, all right, so that's just, if you flatten the rate a little bit, that's what you're looking at, and then you could make that adjustment.
Right. I mean, you see for example, under all of these scenarios, the tax, let me see, oh, this is working. The tax liability for the bottom quintile is 0 for all, you can just barely see that little glimmer of blue there. I mean, that's coming from the family tax credit, right? It's 0 all across the board because the family tax credit remains in effect in all of those.
Well, I heard you speak last week to a group in Morgantown, and you said that there was some conversation about tax reform helping our economy. So do you make an argument that reducing the brackets and like you had them up there, flattening the code, would that be good? I mean, would that, in a sense, you start off with sort of a static analysis, I think, but do you think that that would increase our states, would help our state's economy?
That's a good point. I think simplification certainly would be a good thing. So very loosely, I'd prefer fewer brackets to more, but that's, not to say that I would want a flat rate necessarily, but generally I'd prefer fewer to more. But getting that top rate down might drive, some positive changes. See, those two have lower top rates. So those may drive positive changes, more economic activity, more investment, more entrepreneurship. That would be largely what we would be going for, to get lower rates and more economic activity. But these are designed in a static framework. So actually that's a good point that I meant to mention, is these revenue estimates are actually lower bounds. We would expect to get a little bit more economic activity and thus a little bit more revenue as a result of the lower rates. But it's not going to be a game changer. It's not going to make revenues
Are there any
increase.
game changers you see in our tax code?
I don't know of any game changers in our tax code. I mean, I know of things that we can do that would make the system better and that would improve, but I don't think there's anything that's going to
What would
lead to.
a couple of those?
Well, something that I talked about a lot last year when I was here. One of the times that I was here last year was with the sales tax, with broadening the sales tax base and using that revenue from broadening to other activities, especially services, using that revenue to lower the rate for the sales tax and maybe to lower the rate for the PIT as well, because I would rather have a broader
So
base.
when you talk broadening, you're talking about eliminating some of the exemptions.
Yes, exactly.
Well, let's talk about one, attorney fees. What we heard from business folks on that one was that's a tax on business, that most people who pay the larger fees would be business, and also, and even recently we've seen some of this, your larger firms could just move their work across state lines, and that could cause, that's the type of business that could easily just pick up and go somewhere else, and I'm fearful personally of a negative effect of doing that. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, but the positives would be we'd have lower rates for everybody. Now, I'm not speaking to attorneys' fees specifically. I'd want to take it on a case-by-case basis and be careful as we broaden the base. But generally speaking, broadening the base to services and taxing more things at a lower rate rather than fewer things at a higher rate is probably going to be a good thing, because we just want to get those baseline rates for everybody down where we might be able to draw a positive. But I'd also say, I mean, as we do make these changes, we have to be aware of these issues as well. We want to make sure that those figures don't get out of whack. That's why, I'm proposing that any change that you would consider we'd also consider these numbers as well, just to make sure that we have a good outcome for everybody.
Just wondering on that expanse, in that removal of exemptions, if there's any way to model what would happen if, I think the two large ones, not, if you take health care out of it, then the two large ones are legal services, right, and professional
Public
services.
utility services are the biggest.
CPA.
Public utilities.
Public utility services
Oh,
are by
that's
far the
right,
biggest.
they're in there too. Okay. All right, thank you.
Additional questions? Going once, twice? Thank you so much, yeah, appreciate it. We appreciate it.
No problem. Glad to do it.
Next on our agenda, we'll have, I guess.
I'm just gonna put this down, you can stay here.
It works now.
Oh, this works? Okay, good.
You just have to push the button. We'll have a discussion on our gas, automobile gas taxes. And Mark, do you want to start off for us?
Okay, I think folks should have a handout, and there's a little PowerPoint presentation that'll come up momentarily. And on the handout on the first full page is the current motor fuel tax summary for West Virginia. If you go to the gasoline pump, the total tax that you're going to pay in West Virginia on gasoline right now is 51.6 cents per gallon. And if you're buying diesel, it will be 57.6 cents per gallon. And that includes both a federal component and a state component. The federal tax is 18.4 cents per gallon for gasoline and 24.4 cents per gallon for diesel. The current state tax totals up to 33.2 cents per gallon. That includes two separate components. There's a flat excise tax of 20.5 cents per gallon that's for only highway use. Oh, got the clicker here, so maybe I'll click it. Only highway use yields about somewhere around $10.9 million per penny of tax imposed. So if I add that all up, that's around $225 million a year coming from the flat tax highway use component. There's also a wholesale sales tax, and the wholesale sales tax is on all uses, not just highway uses. It's also off-road uses of various fuels, such as home heating fuel, fuel used for barges, fuel used for railroads, fuel used for industrial use and whatnot. And that's a broader base. And right now, it's based on a wholesale price of $2.54 per gallon, which yields 12.7 cents per gallon in tax. And the yield on that is up to $14 million per penny. And a couple years ago, it was a little higher than $14 million a penny. It's maybe a little lower than $14 million per penny right now because we've seen a bit of a decrease in industrial use in the last couple of years. More so an off-highway situation than an on-highway situation. By the way, fuel is exempt from the consumer sales taxes. So this is a consumption tax in lieu of the consumer sales tax. Other types of energy tend to be, like electricity and natural gas, tend to be subject to some sort of consumption tax, just not motor fuel tax. Real brief on the flat tax component. This is for on-road use only. Off-road use and government use tends to be exempt. Brief history, it started in 1923 at 2 cents per gallon, and it's a flat. It's based on consumption. Because it's a flat tax, is not indexed for inflation. Periodically, the legislatures had to raise that tax rate. For a while there, it was every 2 years. Went to 3.5 cents in 1925, 4 cents in 1927. 1933 is a watermark year. In that year, the state decided to take over all the county roads. West Virginia is unique that way, in that the state basically maintains almost all the roads in West Virginia, whereas other states, local governments have much more responsibility that way. Went to 5 cents in 1937, and then we had a 22-year interlude until we went to 7 cents in 1959 when a motor carrier road tax provision was added. Motor carrier road tax basically is trailer trucks or trucks that have traveled through the state that basically pay tax based on the mileage that's apportioned to the state. In 1970, went to 8.5 cents. 1978, 10.5 cents. Now, in 1983 is when the second component, the motor fuel sales tax, came into place. So just keep that in mind. So we went from 1978, 1989, 15.5 cents. 1993 was the last increase, 20.5 cents. And we've got a record period now, 23 years without a change in that tax rate. It's been 20.5 cents since 1993. Average annual yield, give or take about $5 million, is about $225 million. A couple other little events. In 1994, as a result of some federal legislation, there's the International Fuel Tax Agreement, which means as a motor carrier in interstate commerce, you register with one state, or in the case of a Canadian province, one Canadian province. And that particular province or state is responsible for collecting the motor fuel tax for all jurisdictions, which include 48 states and some Canadian provinces. So it's a much more simplified system for the interstate motor carrier. And then in 2004, the state made a major change to tax at the rack. Close to half the states, including our neighbor state of Virginia, have what I call tax at the rack. That's where the actual initial imposition of the tax is at the rack where you have gasoline is loaded. Most of our racks, by the way, tend to be outside of our state for the most part. So the collection occurs outside the state. If you have some sort of an exemption from this tax, you apply for a refund based upon that exemption. Now, the 5% gasoline and special fuel sales tax, I'm going to spend most of my time on this one. This did not come into play until 1983. And it's 5% of the average wholesale price. The average wholesale price is measured between July 1st and October 31st of the prior year. And in 1983, a minimum floor price was set at 97 cents per gallon, which meant that 5% of that was 4.85 cents per gallon. The collections averaged between $55 and $60 million per year, a higher yield than the excise tax, again, because it was a decision by the legislature back then to make it a broader tax that applies to both on-road and off-road use. I was not here in April of '83, although I was here not a little bit later than that, not much later. But I suspect that because there was sensitivity to interstate tax rates at that time, the legislature made a decision to make a broader based tax as possible, so to maximize the yield for highway use. Prices were fairly stable for gasoline for a long period of time. In fact, the average wholesale price was way below 97 cents per gallon from 1983 all the way to 2000, 17-year period. But then for the first time, we had a price change that occurred in 2000. It reflected in an increase in tax rate to 5.15 cents beginning in calendar year 2001, based on $1.03 per gallon. Between 2002 and 2004, it went back to the 4.85 cents level. And then in 2005 to 6.5 cents. It actually stayed at 6.5 cents in 2006, but only because there was an executive order freezing the wholesale price at $1.30 per gallon. Otherwise, it would have gone to 10 cents in 2006. In 2007, it went to 11 cents per gallon because the price went up to $2.20. So you see, price went up to $2.34 in 2011. And then an additional freeze was put on by legislative action in late 2009 because absent that freeze in 2009, the tax would actually have gone down. It would have gone down by about 10 cents per gallon in 2010 absent this legislation. But this legislation in 2009, in addition to the freeze, also basically raised the minimum floor price to $2.34 per gallon beginning in 2010, and imposed a limit on the annual change in the price, whatever it's calculated to be, to no more than plus or minus 10%. That's in place today. And I neglected to say that the freeze in 2009 was to prevent an increase to 15.4 cents per gallon. But in the interlude between the legislation there was concern that the price was going to go the other way, going down. So that's what created the legislation in 2009. This would be late 2009 special session to increase the minimum floor price to $2.34 and put in the 10% rule. In 2012, the 10% rule applied because the average price rose to $3.16 per gallon, which would be been 15.8 cents. But because of the 10% rule, it went from 11.7 to 12.9. The 10% limit also applied in 2013, where the tax went up by 10% to 14.2 cents per gallon. Then the tax rose to 15.2 cents per gallon in 2014. Began to fall to 14.1 cents per gallon in 2015, 12.7 cents per gallon in 2016, and the 10% limit kept it from falling further. It could have fallen to a little over 9 cents a gallon if it were not for the 10% limit on price change. And barring any type of change or major hurricane or major interruption that would cause prices to rise dramatically between now and the end of October, it looks like the floor price will apply next year, and the tax rate will go from 12.7 down to 11.7 per gallon. Now, the lower wholesale price has a revenue impact. We believe that between the peak year to the trough year, it'll be a loss of 45 to 50 million to the state road fund. In 2014, the estimated revenue was about 212 million related to the 15.2 cent tax. As that tax rate decreases to 11.7, that revenue yield goes down to closer to 164 million over time. And it shows up in the motor fuel tax collections historically. In 2014 fiscal year, we collected 441.1 million at the 35.12. That was a blended rate. This is blended over the entire year because the fiscal year is different from the calendar year. The tax rate changes on a calendar year basis. And actually, collections were enhanced in 14 because the last day, calendar day of fiscal year 13 fell on a Sunday, which is not a good day. Meant that a bunch of collections for June of fiscal year 13 shifted over to 14. So that's why we went all the way up to 441. Those dates matter quite a bit. So in 2015 was a more accurate reflection of true yield. It was around 435 million again at the 35.2 cent level. And then we see that starting to drop a little bit. It dropped to 396.4 million last fiscal year. For whatever reason, even though the last day of June of fiscal year 16 fell on a Thursday, which is a good day, we had a higher than normal carryover revenue to the 1st of July. So if it weren't for that higher carryover, it would have probably been about $404 million for fiscal year 16. And our estimate for 17 is 388.2 million. And certainly by 18, the number's going to go down even further as we average down to 32.2, which would be our floor price in 2018. When we went to tax at the rack legislation in 2004, the due date for the excise tax was changed from the 25th day of every month to the last calendar day of every month. And as a result of that, you have a very erratic revenue pattern from month to month, depending upon what day of the month is the last day. But overall, you end up with a regression equation here that shows a positive gain in the fuel tax. That is, fuel taxes are higher today than they were back in 2008. And that, about 1.6% growth, at least on the change value. And that's because of the gasoline sales tax. That's the component that rises with fuel inflation. Unfortunately, we've had fuel deflation recently. So you notice at the tail end of this curve in May and June of 2016, the yield is now down to $394 million and is falling a bit. That's because the tax rate is decreasing. And this is motor fuel tax history from way back to 1972. And typically the tax yield stays roughly flat until we have a tax increase. When we have a tax increase, the yield rises a little bit with each tax increase. The gasoline sales tax did not come into play until 1983, and that had an impact on the revenues at that point in time. Almost all the increase since 1993-94 is related to the inflation in motor fuel prices. If it weren't for the motor fuel price inflation, let's say the motor fuel sales tax stayed at 4.85 cents per gallon, instead of around 400 million plus in revenue today, we would be getting much closer to 300 million in revenue for the state road fund. So it's a fairly significant difference with that variable tax. And it shows up here, the variable tax in 2004 when the variable was only 4.85 cents per gallon. The overall yield for the road fund was 309.3 million from both taxes. That bounced up to 404 million and by fiscal year 8 because of the rise in fuel prices. Then fuel prices started to level off, and we put the 10% rule in place. But a new peak was reached in fiscal year 14 at 441 million, with a drop to 434 million in 15, and a drop to 396 million in 16. This is a chart that comes out of the Tax Foundation. It shows the federal gas tax, and absent a change in tax rate, and they haven't changed the tax rate since around 1994, the purchasing value of the gas tax declined significantly. And you see the purchasing value of the gas tax at the federal level now is about where it was in 1933. So there's quite a bit of deflationary effect in that regard. The federal government has maintained the money to the states, but only by robbing banks and doing other interesting stuff, but not raising the gas tax. Interesting enough, the amount of money that West Virginia receives in federal funding today is probably no higher in nominal terms than it was 10, 15 years ago. So what that means is that we're relying more on state and local governments to fund highways and less on the federal funding than we had 10 years ago. That's why some states are raising their tax rates. This is just a map of all the states with gasoline tax rates. West Virginia currently is number 14 in the country, so that's higher than the median. States that tend to be in the northern part of the country tend to have problems with snow removal and whatnot, and they tend to have higher tax rates than in the southern part of the country. And I noticed that among West Virginia surrounding states, Pennsylvania is quite a bit higher, and Maryland is just recently moved slightly higher than West Virginia with regard to gasoline tax. In terms of comparison with neighboring states, Kentucky currently is at 26 cents a gallon. Kentucky has both a fixed portion and a variable portion that's based on a wholesale tax rate. Maryland has a tax that's now partially variable based on CPI index, which that's why they're now at 33.5 cents per gallon. Ohio has a fixed only component. They're at 28 cents per gallon. Pennsylvania, 51.4 cents per gallon. Virginia at 22.4. Virginia changed its tax structure to a wholesale tax of 5.1%, and they have a floor price, I believe it was around $3.17 a gallon. That's where we're at right now, is at that floor. And of course, West Virginia at 33.2 cents, which is about 3.5 cents higher than the national average, which is pretty close to 30 cents a gallon. Now, on a per capita basis, West Virginia collects more per capita from gasoline taxes than its surrounding states, including Pennsylvania, even though Pennsylvania has a higher rate. Kentucky also collects a bit higher than national average. And that part of that reason, in addition to maybe some folks driving a little bit further distance to go to work in some of the more rural areas, is that the tax base, particularly in West Virginia, and I think also to some extent in Kentucky, includes some off-road use as well as on-road use. So you have a broader tax base, you end up with a higher yield. But despite that higher yield, in terms of the coverage per mile of state roads, we're near the bottom. Quite a bit less than the U.S. average, $53 per mile versus $13 in West Virginia. And that's because we have more miles per capita. We got a lot of road out there. It curves everywhere. There's a curve in the creek. And we've been building more roads in recent years, so we have more roads to maintain than we had 30 years ago. That yields a lower yield per mile. Plus, the other problem is that we decided not to have the counties participate in funding the roads since 1933. Most of the other states have much greater participation at the local level. Even in Virginia, which is mostly a state-owned system, and their tax changes of just a couple of years ago, they imposed what I call a lot of local area taxes that are being paid by folks in the Metro DC area or Hampton Roads area. They're specifically designed to maintain roads in those areas of high demand. And of course, the legislature recently passed some legislation to try to help Monongalia County with its needs, because Monongalia County has a little higher need maybe than other parts of the state in terms of their road situation. But that's what's so nice about when you have local road maintenance is the degree that what people demand for roads tends to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It allows those scarce resources to flow a little bit more easily to where they need to be used. So that's the road fund picture of the fuel tax.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Questions of Deputy Secretary? How many other states have a variable tax component?
I would say close to half of the other states, but I don't know for sure. I know from our neighboring states. North Carolina is basing theirs on inflation indexing. Virginia is a wholesale price state. Maryland has a component that's variable, that's based on inflation. Pennsylvania, they call it the oil company franchise tax. It's a neat name, but it's a gasoline tax, but it's variable. Kentucky has a variable component. With different rates, all have different rates and different minimum prices, but each one of those states has a minimum price where you can't go below. You can go up, but you cannot go down. In the inflation-adjusted states, particularly Maryland, there's no allowance for deflation. It's only inflation. So if we ever have price decline, it stays flat. So those are just of our surrounding states. The only one that has only a fixed component is Ohio at this time.
So I think your numbers indicated that gasoline tax about $400 million to our road fund, which the total annual budget
For the road?
1.1 billion.
1.1 billion, and
And
quite a bit of
it's-
that's federal. There's some federal funds in that equation that makes it up.
How has that trended over the last 10 years?
Over the last 10 years, the motor fuel tax component has increased the fastest. Of course,
As far as the top line expenditure.
the top line has grown a little bit, but not much. The federal funding is completely flat. There's no growth there at all. And our registration fees, no growth there. The growth is in the motor vehicle sales tax. And there's been some growth there recently, at least until last few months. A pretty good growth. That rises when you buy new cars. Every time I buy a new car, it's a little more expensive than the previous car I bought, it seems. But so that tax tends to rise a little bit over time. And then the gasoline tax, only because of the fuel inflationary adjusted fuel tax, variable fuel tax component, it's increased a bit over time too.
If you're like me, we shouldn't buy cars every 10 years.
I like to keep them about 10 years. 10 years makes a big difference.
Any other
My current car is
questions of Mark?
13 years old, I think, or 12.
John, you want to?
I don't have a whole lot to add. We did what I would call large or major reports on the tobacco excise tax and the PIT, obviously, which I just presented. We were just asked really quickly during last session to write a brief on the gas tax, but Mark has mostly already covered what we looked at. I'll just say really quickly, the question came up, if we would lower our rate 15 cents, how much more gasoline purchases would we get? Would we possibly get enough in additional purchases to make up for the loss in that direct rate? I mean, basically the question was, would we see a Laffer curve effect? That is, would we lower the rate and see more revenues due to such a large behavioral response? We didn't do a full analysis on it because of the turnaround time, but we just looked relatively quickly at the research that's out there that tries to investigate how much people respond to a cut in gasoline excise taxes or gasoline prices in general. And then we just looked at some basic data for West Virginia. Just hit forward.
Oh, forward.
I only have one slide.
Oh, sorry.
Just really quickly, what we found with a brief overview. And let me just say, I totally get the motivation for this question. If we could find a Laffer curve effect, that would be fantastic. It would give us a real golden opportunity. And I certainly understand, especially places like Bluefield and Martinsburg, where we see a lot of cross-border shopping in Virginia. I mean, my home state, by the way, is the thorn in our side here, because they have such low gas prices, they have such low tobacco prices. They're our thorn in their side. So much for my home state, although I consider West Virginia to be my home now, so whatever. Anyway, this figure, I think it says a lot. This figure shows you how much gas prices have changed over the last 15 years or so. And of course, the answer is, a lot. Gas prices have changed a lot, moving from $1.50 up to $4. A lot of movement all across the board in gas prices. But then the blue line shows you how much gas purchases in West Virginia have changed. And the answer is not nearly as much. About 250% movement in gas prices, but at most a 77% movement in gas purchases, and most of that came right at the beginning of the window. Overall, without doing a full study, it seems unlikely, based on the research that's out there and just by a cursory overview of the data, it seems unlikely that we would get a doubling of purchases if we lowered that rate by 15 cents. The thing is, if our rate's 30%, if our rate's 30 cents, if we have a 15 cent cut, we got to double gas sales to make up for that rate cut. Now, it's not quite that because our rate's a little bit more than 30, but you get the idea. But it seems unlikely to me. I'm not saying whether it be a good move or a bad move. That's a different question. But just the notion that we'd get a doubling in sales or nearly a doubling in sales seems unlikely based on past data. That's all I have.
Chairman Hall?
I just have one question, Mark. On your chart that's got the per mile tax receipts per mile for state highways, and let's take Maryland. We know that Maryland has county roads, correct?
Yes.
So is that $115, is that what they're able to use for just the state roads? They collect that?
That's just for the state roads, and then the counties that are responsible for their local roads. Now, some of the states, some of the gas money, tax money does go to help the local folks maintain their roads, but the local folks tend to use their local revenues as well, particularly property taxes, and in some states have their own gasoline tax at the local level, not necessarily saying that's a good or bad idea.
I guess I'm trying to say this is a fair comparison, that the $115 per mile of a state road is what is collected as compared to ours at 13.
Yeah, they have far fewer state road miles.
Now, Virginia's lower. So
Virginia is like us. Virginia has a lot of state-owned roads. And although they've been moving to try to get local folks to pay more.
Additional questions? Yes, Gerhard? That's okay. We in the room can hear you loud and clear.
Probably too loud. And I get where if the tax were to be cut in half, you'd have to double the volume in order to make the difference. But Virginia's tax, if we're just simply talking about Virginia, isn't half of ours. It is a percentage above half.
That would put us underneath, it would allow us to undercut Virginia.
So if we were at an equivalent rate, we'd still have to increase that kind of volume. But aren't there a variety of ancillary benefits that come along it? And you mentioned Bluefield,
Definitely.
Martinsburg, and I'm sitting next to Martinsburg, and I'm...
Well, I mean, beer sales go along with it, right?
Well, it's not only beer sales, but...
That's just one example.
Yeah, when anecdotally, where I am, you can't buy a gallon of gas.
All the
I dare you
shops
to
are,
come to Bluefield and find one. I bet it'd take you an hour.
yeah, they're all in
So,
Virginia.
But even if you're dealing with traveling public, for the most part, the traveling public comes through Bluefield. They gas in Virginia, they hold their breath and hope they can make it to South Carolina if they're going south, because, the cost, the price of gas.
North Carolina
is a driving factor as to where people stop.
Mhm.
It's also a driving factor as to where the outlets are. It's a well-known, I doubt anyone here would tell you that when they drive to the beach, they don't stop in Bithville to get fuel, because there is a plethora of truck stop fueling type places that do all of the different things that they do, that locate just across the line, if you will, in Virginia, to avoid West Virginia and be strategically placed so that they can get through North Carolina. So I guess my point is that with that less amount, is it possible that those kind of volume things could in fact show that the reduction in the gas tank could not only increase, get us to the point where our gas tax is level or increasing, but also enhance the other business components that would benefit our state?
Let me just say, again, just to reiterate, we did full studies on the tobacco and PIT, but this kind of came at the last
I'm not
minute.
asking you to
But-
delve the numbers that quick, I'm just
And
asking about the possibility.
And this one was just a quick turnaround, but I mean, it is possible that a lot of more stuff goes along with it. I mean, I was just gonna say, I decided to cross into Virginia to get gas, but I get beer to go along with that. I hope I don't start drinking until I get back home, but whatever. It is true that a lot more could go with it, and I wasn't saying that we should or shouldn't cut the gas tax. I was just saying that gasoline purchases, unlikely they would respond that much, but maybe we need a fuller analysis to think more about all these other things that can go along with gas purchases, and I'm always ready to do more if I can, if the data allows. So I'd be glad to continue that
And
conversation.
again, this is more a curiosity as it spins in my mind, and again, I'm assuming gentlemen here in this room probably travel south to recreate.
No, I mean, I travel right through
And
Bluefield. I turn
am
off
certain
at exit
that
1.
As you go through there, you probably think, well, I want to buy gas 20 cents cheaper if I go another 30 miles. That's probably what I will do. It's not but a few dollars, but we see the numbers on the sign, and most of us consider
Sure.
that a commodity, and what's the difference where I buy it? It's,
No, I completely get the point. I mean, I drive to my parents' house and, you know, I see the differences in gas prices, and I kind of hate to admit, but sometimes I do wait until I cross the line before I get gas. Sorry about that. I hope you don't hold that against me.
Well, and it's, you know, I use this example, and it's a business example, it's not that but the mayor of Bluefield, West Virginia owns a gas station that I can pump gas with 1 foot in West Virginia and pay the tax in Virginia where the gas comes in. So, it's an odd circumstance, but there are gasoline outlets clustered at the state line where I'm from, where you can, you know, you don't have to walk very far to get into a different state.
Sure. No, I'll be glad to look at it more in depth to see if we can take a broader view of it.
Thanks.
We'll just have to see what the data allow for.
Additional questions of either of the gentlemen? Well, thank you very much. And, you know, so the personal income tax, just stepping back on that, so $1.8 billion, and obviously that brings in 40% of our general revenue budget. So that's one reason why it's a hot topic. And the chairman mentioned the consumer sales tax, which brings in, was it 1.3 roughly billion?
Closer to 1.2 billion, but, yeah,
Well, we're hoping for 1.3
it's, yeah,
this year.
yes, we are.
That will be a future topic, but the committee was asked by both chairs to chime in when you can as it relates to future topics. Our goal last year was one on a broad basis to open up and inform everyone of our various taxes in a broad sense. And I think our goal through the interims is one of focus in on individual rates or taxes that we can lead into some legislation if need be come next session. And so do welcome the feedback. This is we all have to participate. And as far as miscellaneous business, the chairs decided to form a subcommittee that will deal strictly with the business personal property and inventory tax. The members of that subcommittee, in addition to the chairs, Senator Gaunch, Senator Carnes, and Senator Stallings, and then Delegate Anderson, Delegate Householder, and Delegate Phillips. And I would expect we'll set some schedule and an agenda to move forward on that. No future date has been set for this committee, but I would expect our next interims we would have a follow-up and welcome input from the members. And is that what, September 19th or 20th? So, yeah. Do you have anything else? Any other business for the committee? Vice Chairman Hall's recognized for a motion to adjourn. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. We're adjourned.